the Marshall Islands constituted a block in the path of the U.S. drive westward. If that drive was to be successful, several strategically located islands in that group must be seized. In Hawaii, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, and everyone in his command were vitally concerned with the preparations for the forthcoming assault on the Marshalls. For the Central Pacific Offensive, begun so auspiciously with the victories in the Gilbert Islands at Macon and Tarawa, depended for its success on a quick follow-up. The planned invasion of atolls in the next major island chain, the Marshalls, was to be followed by further assaults on islands still far to westward, in a giant island-hopping operation, which would take American fighting forces to the very doorstep of Japan itself. In January 1944, the High Command in the Central Pacific Theater checked carefully over final preparations for the all-important invasion of the Marshalls. The amphibious assault force left Hawaii behind and headed for the Marshalls in late January. Stealthily, the fleet moved into enemy waters. Gunners in the mightiest invasion fleet yet mounted prepared to knock out enemy defenses on the target islands. This time they planned to see to it that no one could possibly consider the naval shelling too light. On January 29th, the warships began their softening up of Kwajalein Atoll. Liberators of the 7th Air Force pounded the atolls in the eastern and central Marshalls. At Kwajalein, the world's largest coral atoll, the main objectives were 3 small islands. Roy and Namur, linked by an artificial causeway, were to be seized by the 4th Marine Division. En route to the invasion of the islands, Marine officers familiarized the men with all available details of their objective, their size, shape, and defenses. Kwajalein Atoll, the 4th Marine Division went into action for the first time. Most of the men had arrived only recently from Marine training camps in the United States. For the first time, the assault waves took their own supplies with them. H-hour, delayed almost 2 hours, was only minutes away. The men would be real veterans soon. Waves of Marines neared the landing beaches, the carrier pilots gave the enemy a last-minute once-over. The men were prepared for another Tarawa. American troops were storming the first piece of pre-war Japanese territory. And from all indications, the enemy planned to hold on to it. The 4th Division Marines were loaded for action. They were prepared for the worst. It was tough on the beach, but it was no Tarawa. Although enemy resistance was lighter than expected, the battle was no pushover. The area was still far from secure. The troops at Kwajalein benefited enormously from the experience other American fighting men had had on similar atolls in the Gilberts some 2 months before. The pattern for dealing with a dug-in enemy on a tiny sand spit of an island had been successfully established. The Marines took every precaution in dealing with the fanatical defenders of Roy and Namur. The Marines took some prisoners at Roy and Namur, but they represented only a small percentage of the enemy force which defended the island. 264 Japanese were captured on the two islands. But there were still many pockets of enemy resistance. On Roy, the principal objective was the enemy airfield. Taking it was no simple task. During the afternoon, the battle raged on. By late afternoon, the back of enemy resistance on Roy was broken. This time, the naval and air bombardment had achieved some notable results. The airfield on Roy was seized on D-Day afternoon. The strips had constituted an important launching platform for enemy planes. A number of the Japanese planes had been in no condition to leave the island before it fell. Namur was wrested from the enemy by the early afternoon of the second day. On that island, too, the sturdy Japanese blockhouses had proved unable to withstand the U.S. bombardment. The enemy defenses were a favorite subject for combat artists, who sometimes accompanied the assault troops on Pacific invasions. The blockhouses proved equally fascinating to every Marine on the island. The enemy high command had ordered Roy and Namur defended to the last man. Marine General Holland Smith, in command of the ground forces in the Marshalls, was well pleased with the performance of the untested 4th Marine Division. The general was favorably impressed, too, with the job the Navy warships had done. In other operations, he was not usually satisfied with the Navy's bombardment. But at Kwajalein, he felt they had done well by his amphibious forces. The Japanese who garrisoned Roy and Namur hadn't believed it possible for their stronghold to fall to an American overwater assault. After the battle, the Marines had an opportunity to inspect the souvenirs they'd collected. The most highly prized memento throughout the Pacific was a Japanese samurai sword, usually carried only by high-ranking enemy officers. There was plenty of Japanese money for the invaders, but no place to spend it. The men who'd made the assault hadn't had a chance to take their shoes off since leaving the transports for the invasion. They almost felt civilized again. With the battle won, U.S. forces had reached another milestone on the road to Tokyo. Many of the men who had helped achieve that forward step had been cut down during the battle. In all cases possible, positive identification of the dead was sought by the Graves Registration Section of the 4th Marine Division. Casualties were light compared with the figures of American losses on Tarawa. But 190 Marines lost their lives at Roy and Namur in the struggle to establish a foothold for U.S. forces in the Marshalls. Each new victory in the drive across the Pacific was marked by still another burial service and the dedication of another square of hallowed ground, thousands of miles from home. The men who survived felt a very real sense of loss, for a strong feeling of kinship springs up between men in battle for a common cause. The dead would not be forgotten by the men who had fought with them side by side. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army's 7th Division was occupied with the enemy on the southernmost island of Kwajalein Atoll. On February 1st, in mid-morning, the assault waves moved into the beach. These GIs had last seen action on the Aleutians in quite a different setting. World War II was the first major war to be thoroughly covered by combat cameramen. To record the war on film, motion picture cameramen went ashore with the first waves of assault troops and stayed with them in the thick of the fight. The 7th Division GIs pushed across the island against spotty enemy opposition. On that first day on Kwajalein, U.S. casualties were light. Less than 70 men were hit by enemy fire. With the tanks pacing the advance, the GIs took the island yard by yard. The soldiers pressed the attack in the face of stiffening enemy resistance. Tanks played a major role in the victories in the marshals, but it was still the men with the rifles who seized and held the territory. On Kwajalein Islet, the coordination of tanks and infantry operating together had still not been perfected. But the advance was well executed. It was no easy job to overwhelm all the enemy troops on the island. For 5 days, the 7th Division GIs battled the enemy on Kwajalein. And for 5 days, the enemy had to be located and blasted out of his holes. More enemy soldiers were being knocked out of the battle by the determined GIs. Enemy casualties mounted steadily. The weary GIs continued the attack against a well-entrenched enemy. As on Roy and Namur to the north, the Japanese garrison on Kwajalein Islet had solid positions from which to carry on their stubborn defense of the island. In the process of seizing the islet from the enemy, 1,214 American soldiers were hit on Kwajalein. The lightness of American casualties could be traced to the more careful preparation on the part of both the Army and Navy. On February 5th, the battle on Kwajalein Islet had been won. After the spirited struggle, 170 enemy troops were taken prisoner, all that was left of a garrison force of some 4,000. The enemy had lost the 3 key islands of one of the most strategic atolls in the Central Pacific. The defeated troops were beginning to have a few doubts about the invincibility of the Japanese war machine. In February 1944, U.S. forces pushed deeper into enemy territory, to the extreme western end of the Marshall Islands chain. Eniwetok Atoll was invaded in mid-February by 2 regiments, 1 Marine, 1 Army. The 22nd Marine Regiment landed first on Njebe Islet, and in a furious day-long battle knocked out a strong enemy garrison. The Marines on Njebe were seeing action for the first time, and they acquitted themselves well. Tanks were used to good advantage in the Marine assault on Njebe. The 3 principal islets of Eniwetok Atoll were successfully seized by the 5 battalions of Marines and soldiers in 7 days. On Eniwetok Islet, U.S. soldiers and Marines choked off enemy resistance, but not without suffering some losses. Many of the casualties among the riflemen were attributable to the light bombardment of this particular islet. On Parry Islet, 22nd Regiment Marines fought almost a duplicate of their earlier battle on Njebe, except that the enemy on Parry held out a bit more stubbornly. But the Marines mopped it up on the second day. During the final stages of the fight to seize the major islands of Eniwetok Atoll, work on the airstrips was being carried forward, often under enemy fire, by the hard-working members of a Navy service known as the Seabees. Organized early in World War II, the Navy's construction battalions achieved miracles in building airstrips on islands all across the Pacific in unbelievably short periods of time and under any conditions. The Seabees never wasted any time. The job was always done the quickest possible way. And the Seabees never lost an opportunity to take advantage of whatever came their way, including enemy equipment. On Eniwetok Atoll, a strip capable of accommodating 4 squadrons of fighters was hurriedly finished. The speed with which the Seabees could build an airstrip on any kind of terrain was a constant source of wonder to the fighting men in the area. Even the Army was impressed with the Seabees' accomplishments in the Pacific. The work of the construction battalions on islands all across the Pacific was greatly admired by the Marine Corps, charged with seizing and holding those bases. The Seabees' most vital functions included the construction and repair of airstrips, of coral and sand. For on the speed with which those airstrips were put into operation depended the speed of the continuing advance toward Japan. The majority of the 250,000 men in the Seabees had had experience in some phase of construction work before entering the service. That experience proved invaluable to the U.S. fighting forces. But even the most knowledgeable construction men were faced with many completely new problems on the islands of the Pacific. Once their job was done, the Seabees never had long to wait to see the results of their work. Windmill washing machines became familiar sights on the islands where the Seabees were on the job. Just one evidence of the versatility of the Navy's newest branch. But aids to comfortable living in the tropics were only spare time projects. After the airstrips were built or repaired on an island base, the Seabees fell to work on the construction of the necessary buildings for the forces which would garrison the new base. The job of creating a camp the size of a small city was usually only a few weeks' work for a battalion of Seabees. Their favorite boast, "We do the difficult immediately, the impossible takes a little longer," was not considered an overstatement by the troops in the Pacific. The housing of the fighting men was only one of the Seabees' responsibilities. One of the impossible jobs they performed was providing ice at tropical Pacific bases. Whatever the need, the Seabees could be counted on to fill it, and without delay. Their philosophy was summed up in a standard two-word answer to any request: can do. The U.S. now had possession of two key atolls in the Marshalls Group. Those two quick victories on a few sandy islands made a considerable difference in the areas of control exercised by the two principal warring powers in the Pacific. For from the Marshalls, the U.S. Air Force was in excellent position to launch attacks against the Caroline Islands, and in particular the enemy's powerful base at Truk. From Kwajalein in mid-March, 7th Air Force bombers began a series of strikes against that enemy stronghold. The Liberators could make the trip from Kwajalein to Truk and return in less than 9 hours, if the weather was favorable for that period. The 7th Air Force planes were reinforced by bombers of the 13th Air Force operating from South Pacific bases. The target, the group of islands called Truk, was the most important enemy staging area between Japan and the Southwest Pacific. The legend of Truk's invincibility was about to be punctured effectively. Liberators were depositing the new 2,000-pound bombs on the enemy's base. The attacks were highly successful. In less than 4 months, once mighty Truk was to become virtually useless to the enemy. In a single month in early 1944, U.S. Air Force planes dropped a total of 1,813 tons of bombs on Truk. The enemy's stronghold was reduced to a mere shell. In the Southwest Pacific, as 1943 turned into 44, the U.S. fighting forces centered their attention on the Bismarck Archipelago and the northern coast of New Guinea, the road which led back to...
So as a precaution, buy a package of BC headache powders tonight and be free to enjoy yourself to the fullest this weekend.
In Australia during 1942 and 43, the attention of everyone on that island continent was concentrated on the road back, a series of campaigns to be made by Allied forces under the overall command of General Douglas MacArthur.
When I landed on your soil, I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return. Tonight, I repeat those words. I shall return. Nothing is more certain than the ultimate reconquest and liberation from the enemy of those and adjacent lands.
By late 1943, the road back against the enemy lay principally along the northern coast of New Guinea, up the tail of the bird-shaped island. By December, U.S. Marines and soldiers had moved virtually all the way up the Solomon Islands chain. To westward, U.S. and Australian forces attacked the enemy in the Bismarck Archipelago area. On December 15th, the strategically situated island of New Britain was invaded. The assault was made by the Army's 112th Cavalry Regiment, 1,700 strong. The invasion craft were attacked by more than 30 Japanese planes. The invasion was carried out successfully, despite intense air activity over the landing beaches. The soldiers in the assault waves hadn't expected to be hit before reaching the beach. At Arawa, for the first time in a combat operation, rockets were used to soften up the beaches. The landings were successfully achieved in spite of the heavy enemy air attack. And a beachhead was established. Attached to the 158th Infantry Regiment at Arawa was a group of American Indians who were used chiefly as scouts. Stealthily seeking out enemy troop concentrations was a specialty of the Indians throughout the war in many Pacific battles. Ground forces officers came to appreciate how valuable the Indians were in their reconnaissance assignments. Silent and sure-footed, the Indian scouts went out on mission after mission behind the enemy lines. In a war which called for the employment of stealth and deception, the Indians were beating the enemy at his own game. In addition to serving as scouts and snipers, the Indians often functioned as couriers. They were most adept at carrying important messages safely through territory not yet completely won. In the South and Southwest Pacific, another small group of men called Coast Watchers played a major part in many Allied victories in that area. Coast Watchers were men who were thoroughly familiar with the territory held by the enemy. Top priority information on weather conditions and on the enemy's latest activities was gathered by these volunteers, who worked with the help of friendly natives behind enemy lines. Discovery, of course, would mean instant death. The Coast Watchers, most of whom were Australian, transmitted this vital information to the Allies by radio. After each transmission, the CW would usually be forced to change its location to circumvent discovery by the enemy. If the message got through successfully to Allied units in the area, an invasion force or air or naval strike group could move in on enemy targets more quickly and also cut down on their own casualties. In late December 1943, after the Arawa diversion, a U.S. invasion was planned at another point on western New Britain, at Cape Gloucester. In a pre-invasion strike, U.S. 5th Air Force planes strafed enemy positions and dropped 400 tons of bombs on the beaches. was begun on the day after Christmas, 1943. The assault troops were 1st Division Marines. Most of the men in the assault waves were veterans of the long, bloody campaign fought by the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal. Commanded by Marine General William Rupertus, the troops went quickly about the business of launching the invasion. The scheduled plan for the assault on Cape Gloucester was executed successfully by the invasion force of Marines. Resistance was not expected to be heavy, but then no one could be entirely certain. The main landing was made on the east coast of Cape Gloucester. The beaches had been thoroughly softened up by pre-invasion bombardments, and enemy opposition was light. An unusual situation for marine assault waves in the Pacific in 1943. With the beachhead quickly seized, tanks came ashore, and the drive was on for the capture of the all-important airfield. Though the enemy wasn't particularly troublesome for the first few days, the great morass of mud slowed the Marine advance down. But the riflemen, working closely with the tanks, kept pushing inland without pause. The Marine tank crews handled their vehicles adroitly in the matted jungle, drawing praise from the Army. Every effective weapon was used against the dug-in enemy. After 22 days, the enemy was largely put to rout. The Marines carved up the disorganized clusters of enemy troops who hadn't fled toward Rabaul. The U.S. had succeeded to complete control of western New Britain. The enemy was fast losing his South Seas empire. The attack on Rabaul on the far eastern tip of New Britain was stepped up in early 1944. Thousands of tons of bombs were dropped on the enemy's one-time stronghold. In a 6-month campaign, U.S. planes knocked out Japan's most powerful base in the Southwest Pacific. Rabaul was rendered completely useless to the enemy. For the ground forces, there was one more important area in the Bismarck archipelago, the Admiralty Islands. The U.S. command decided that they must be taken. Before the actual invasion of the islands, a reconnaissance party went ashore on Los Negros to determine the enemy's strength. For 24 hours, they took stock and discovered that the island, seemingly deserted though it looked, was actually heavily garrisoned. It had been decided to assault Los Negros first, and then invade Manus, the larger island. The GIs, who were experiencing their baptism of fire, headed toward shore on the morning of February 29th, 1944. Less than 24 U.S. planes appeared, owing to poor weather. The assault soldiers were expecting heavy resistance on the beaches. A good percentage of the GIs landed successfully, but once ashore, they found themselves in a furious battle against a determined enemy. It was a rough fight. In the campaign on the Admiralties, U.S. ground forces suffered some 1,200 casualties. Thanks to blood plasma and newly developed drugs, many of the men who had been badly wounded were saved. With the capture of the two principal islands in the Admiralties, the entire Bismarck area was sealed off. The U.S. forces now controlled the strategic airstrips, which had been used with great effectiveness by the enemy. The quickening offensive in New Guinea required the use of all available Army divisions. General Frederick Irving sped the 24th on its way into combat.
You're about to embark on your great adventure, probably the greatest adventure that has occurred to you during your lifetime. It is the operation we've been looking forward to for a long time. We're all ready. Now, there are a few miscellaneous things that I want to mention tonight. First is, I want to prepare you mentally for the confusion of combat. If you keep quiet, the Jap does not know anything about you, but as soon as you fire your rifle, it's the same as saying, "Here I am." At the same time, you have little chance of hitting anybody in the dark. You have a big chance of hitting your own men. So keep that in mind. Firing at night, spasmodically and so forth, is a mark of ill-disciplined and untrained troops. I don't expect any of that in this division. In conclusion, I want to wish you the best of luck in this operation. These organizations have a grand reputation. I know that when the story of this war is written, that you'll have more than your share of the decorations and honors, and that there'll be no units, no combat team that will acquit themselves any better than will this combat team here.
The next jump in the leapfrog operation up the back of the New Guinea bird was to CITP, some 400 miles westward. The offensive force was a powerful one, the largest fleet to support any landing in the Southwest Pacific Theater up to this point, accompanied an assault force of some 22,500 troops. A large proportion of the soldiers who were to make the invasion at CITP were battle-wise veterans of earlier New Guinea engagements, like the men of the 163rd Infantry Regiment.
We'd been in a few scraps with the enemy on New Guinea, but nothing this big. This time it looked as though we were really going to throw a punch. It was quite a show. The bombardment cheered us all up. The more those big guns pounded the beaches, the fewer Japs there would be to meet us when we went ashore. We started for the beach soon after dawn. We were all a little nervous, and that choppy sea didn't help that feeling in the pit of the stomach. Funny thing, but no matter how many combat landings you made, you never completely got over that case of nerves just before the battle. Once the shooting started on shore, the spell was usually broken, and you'd be so busy keeping on the alert that you wouldn't have time to be nervous.
The initial resistance to the landing at CITP was relatively light, but as the battle progressed, U.S. forces were subsequently to cut off and chop up the enemy's entire 18th Army. At the same time, a larger U.S. force was landing some 125 miles farther west at Hollandia in Dutch New Guinea. Invasions were made at 2 points along the coast. Opposition on both beaches was light. The first phase of the attack was carried out according to plan. The men of the Army's 41st and 24th Divisions executed the operation without a hitch.
General, the first wave was landed on schedule and met no opposition. Swell. Couldn't be better. Thanks.
The plan called for the troops to drive quickly inland toward the 3 airfields, which were the principal objectives. In the ooze of the northern New Guinea coastal area, the troops were faced with a serious transportation problem. Now and then, the GIs encountered the enemy. but they offered no serious problem. With the two invasion forces linked up, the sought-after airfields in the Santani area fell to the U.S. after only 5 days. But it soon became apparent that because of the swampy terrain, the strips could not be built into major bases. A month later, U.S. forces moved 145 miles farther west along the Bird's Back. By seizing an area on the New Guinea coast at Toom, artillery could be employed to shell the real objective, the island of Wakta, 2 miles offshore. From the beachhead near Toom, assault troops launched the shore-to-shore invasion of Wakta Island. Spearhead of that assault was the 163rd Infantry Regiment, the same men who had landed at CITP 3 weeks earlier.
For some reason, somebody decided that we had to have Wakta Island, probably because the airfield was a little better than the last ones we took. It was a short but tough battle. The enemy troops on Wakta were well dug in, and we had to use our most efficient weapons for getting at them and knocking them out of the battle. We killed almost 800 in the 2-day fight on Wakta.
8 days later, U.S. soldiers made still another landing at Biak, 180 miles westward in Gilvink Bay. Just before the landing, the rocket ships went to work. Rockets were proving more effective than naval gunfire in last-minute bombardments of the invasion beaches. The GIs of the 41st Division who made the assault on Biak were expecting a rough time once they arrived on shore. 12,000 men went ashore on Biak on that first day. 12 medium tanks were landed during the first 10 hours. The battle at Biak didn't get started in earnest until the U.S. force was well established ashore. U.S. Shermans were to play a responsible part in the Allied victory in the pitched battle. Biak turned into one of the most hotly contested engagements in the Southwest Pacific Theater. The enemy refused to surrender the island. 2.5 weeks after the battle on Biak began, General Robert L. Eichelberger was placed in command of the ground forces, with orders to bring the bloody fight to a successful conclusion. For the second time in New Guinea, General Eichelberger cleaned up a messy operation. In early July, another hop to Numfor Island carried the U.S. drive 80 miles still farther west. The small island in Gilvink Bay was invaded by some 7,000 GIs of the 158th Regimental Combat Team. The assault force expected to encounter heavy opposition on the only beach where a landing was feasible. But the initial beachhead was established quickly and with comparative ease. The U.S. invasion force outnumbered the enemy on Numfor by 3 or 4 to 1. Once more, the GIs were prepared for a grueling campaign. But the U.S. command had overestimated the enemy's strength on the island. Against light resistance, the GIs moved quickly across the island. But the command still expected trouble and called for reinforcements to be dropped by parachute over the recently seized airfield. The paratroopers making the jump were the men of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, most of them veterans of the drop on Natsap earlier in the New Guinea campaign. But this time, the operation was poorly executed. The troopers had been scheduled to drop a distance of at least 400 feet, but some were disgorged from the planes at heights as low as 175 feet. In addition, the plane should have flown in single file rather than two abreast. And the landing area chosen was so narrow that only a part of the group managed to land on the field. Many of the men missed the drop zone. some by a wide margin. Of the 739 men who made the initial jump at Numfor, almost 10% were casualties, and not related in any way to enemy action. Nevertheless, by the 5th day, all 3 airfields on Numfor were in U.S. possession, and all that was left was mopping up. Numfor was by no means the final objective in the New Guinea campaign. In late July, the next hop to Sansapor took the U.S. forces to the head of the New Guinea bird. The landing was not opposed, but the 20,000 GIs of the 6th Division were taking no chances. The assault was made against an enemy which was discovered to be in the process of evacuating the area. U.S. forces had succeeded in driving across the length of New Guinea to the very tip of the 1,500-mile-long island. In mid-September, U.S. soldiers invaded Morotai, an island in the Moluccas, lying between New Guinea and the Philippines. With this engagement, the New Guinea campaign was successfully concluded, a never-to-be-forgotten experience in the lives of the men who fought there, from the greenest private to General Eichelberger.
Historians will state that the 2-year fight for New Guinea was one of the toughest in modern warfare. I agree with them. The men who served under my command in New Guinea from 1942 until late 44 fought day and night under conditions which would have broken the spirit of less stout-hearted troops. Fighting on that terrain in that abominable climate and against an enemy as resourceful as the Japanese was tough enough, but the tropical diseases, malaria, dengue fever, scrub typhus, jungle rot, provided the finishing touches. The fact that we won that most vital island after some 20-odd months of dogged battling is a tribute to the fighting qualities of the American soldier. While my gratitude goes out to our brothers of the Navy and Air, as an infantry commander, I must say that New Guinea was a war of infantrymen, United States and Australia. And by virtue of our victory on New Guinea, the invasion of the Philippines was made possible.
While the leapfrogging hops were made in the Southwest Pacific, U.S. amphibious forces in the Central Pacific were engaged in their own campaign of island hopping. The Marianas were a most strategically important invasion target in June 1944.
Mutual presents George Olson's music. Music.
The war with Japan had several memorable turning points, all directly affecting the final outcome. In the struggle for the Marianas in the summer of 1944, the enemy's leaders realized that if U.S. forces were successful at Saipan, Japan could prepare itself for eventual defeat. In Hawaii, the troops scheduled to see action in the Marianas prepared to embark on the journey to the target. General Ralph Smith commanded the Army's 27th Division, one of the 3 divisions earmarked for the campaign on Saipan. During the last days of May 1944, the men became part of the northern troops and landing force assigned to the Saipan operation. By the 1st of June, the last elements of the divisions which would oppose the enemy on Saipan were aboard ship, and Operation Forager was begun. While the attack force was en route, word of the landings on the beaches of Normandy came through. But the assault forces on the ships were occupied with their own invasion, a campaign just as vital to final victory in the Pacific as the Normandy invasion was to the European triumph. 3 days before D-Day on Saipan, scout planes flew reconnaissance missions to search out any enemy naval force. The men were briefed thoroughly on the principal features of the landing area. The task force neared the objective. Before dawn on D-Day, the carrier planes were readied for their last pre-invasion strikes. was bright, clear, and hot. U.S. planes continued to work over the target in the teeth of enemy flak. From all appearances, the battle ahead looked like a tough one. At dawn, the warships provided a staccato introduction to the invasion. The Navy had a wide range of targets to concentrate on. The naval guns worked overtime. Now and then they had to be cooled off before going back into action. With each hour less than an hour away, the assault force of Marines who were to carve out the beachhead on Saipan prepared for one more landing against a carefully entrenched enemy. No matter how often a Marine went ashore against heavy enemy opposition, each new landing seemed just as tough or tougher than the last. Even veterans like Marine Private First Class Harry Jackson of Pitchfork, Wyoming, never got really used to the feeling that went with going in on an enemy beach.
After a couple of tough landings, you couldn't help figuring that the law of averages was working against you. In a way, it was a good feeling to be on solid ground again, but that meant you were wide open. Even though your buddies were all around, you felt all alone on a beach like Saipan. At least on this one, the men got into the beach. That hard ball in the pit of your stomach never left until you saw the first guy near you get hit. That did it. You wanted to even the score for the guys who got it. Saipan was rough right from the word go, and this time there was a lot more island to take than there was on some of those atolls. The first few hours on the island gave us a good idea of what the campaign was going to be like. Somebody said the 2,000 Marines got hit that first day. Nobody doubted it. They finally called for some more support from the cans offshore. And the Zoomies gave us a hand once in a while, too. After the first couple of days, we had a pretty good idea the place was ours, with no ifs, ands, or buts. Then we moved on in to take over a real chunk of the island. But it wasn't any cinch. Those tanks were handy to have around. Sometimes you'd be able to save a guy who got hit bad using the tank as a shield. Speaking of things that were handy to have around, those rockets weren't just whistling Dixie. By D-Day +3, we'd taken Aslito Airfield, the enemy's most important air base on the island. The Japs had really had it at Aslito. They pulled out awful fast.
By June 18th, a sizable area had been seized by the assault Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions, assisted, beginning on the second day, by GIs of the Army's 27th Division. After Aslito Field had been taken by the soldiers, land-based planes in considerable numbers could be used in support of the drive north on the island. The 3 divisions, 2 Marine, 1 Army, worked abreast up the island. On Saipan, both sides used tanks. In general, American mediums proved superior to the Japanese variety. In one pitched battle lasting 3.5 hours, 31 enemy tanks were knocked out. The enemy counterattack had been successfully beaten off. But the fight to gain control of the southern sector of Saipan had taken its toll of assault troops. During the first week of the campaign, the U.S. invasion force suffered some 6,000 casualties in the campaign to gain control of this valuable cornerstone of the enemy's defense perimeter. The day before D-Day, the U.S. naval force off Saipan learned that a Japanese fleet was moving into the Philippine Sea off Saipan's west coast to contest the invasion. The enemy naval force raced east from the Philippines, but was met by a strong U.S. armada in the Philippine Sea. U.S. carrier pilots could scarcely wait for this chance to close with the Japanese fleet. Pilots headed straight for the enemy force. The Japanese ships were prepared for a battle, but not for the one that was shaping up in the Philippine Sea. The Japanese gun crews looked forward to a good day's shooting. The enemy fleet was well set for the engagement when the first contact was made. The U.S. planes swarmed all over the Japanese fleet. Enemy planes fought back desperately. The enemy air group began losing its planes in some numbers. The U.S. air complement suffered some casualties, too. But the enemy was overwhelmingly beaten in the 2-day battle in the Philippine Sea, which came to be known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The enemy threat to the beachhead on Saipan was completely dissipated. Of the 216 American planes which pursued the fleeing enemy ships, about half returned safely to their home carrier. Not all escaped unscathed. Some pilots were born lucky. Some of the men who made a U.S. victory possible had fought their last battle.
For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Unto Almighty God we commend the soul of our brother departed, and we commit his body to the deep. In sure and certain hope of the resurrection unto eternal life. Amen.
Once more, the Pacific received its dead. In the battle off the Marianas, the enemy not only failed in its intended purpose, but suffered one of the most humiliating defeats it had ever experienced. On shore at Saipan, the campaign was gaining momentum. The toughest objective on the island was Tapachau, a 1,500-foot mountain whose crest dominated the whole of Saipan. That crest had to be seized from the enemy at any cost. Marines and soldiers pushed the attack up its slopes for several days. But the joint assault by the Marines and Army troops was not well synchronized. In overall command of the ground campaign on Saipan, Marine General Holland Smith was dissatisfied with the cautious forward advance of the Army troops. On June 24th, the general lived up to his nickname, Howlin' Mad, and fired the Army commander. The controversy over the Marine general's action raged as fiercely as the battle itself. At the same time, along the west coast of the island, Marines of the 2nd Division pressed into the outskirts of Garapan, capital city of the Marianas, and got their first taste of street fighting. Thousands of Chamorros, whose homes had been demolished, walked into the American lines at the first opportunity. U.S. fighting men made certain that the natives were out of harm's way. Many Chamorros had been hiding in caves for more than a week with little food and water. Some were on the edge of starvation when they came into American hands. Some Chamorros, no one knows how many, were killed in the violent battle for their island home. The natives of Saipan would not soon forget the summer of 1944. By July 7th, U.S. forces had seized the major part of the island. Early that morning, the Japanese made a large-scale banzai charge against the U.S. position. The frenzied Japanese drove deep into American lines, into territory held by U.S. artillery. The charge was finally stopped in a bitter hand-to-hand struggle. More than 2,000 Japanese were killed. Faced with the loss of their island base, they had chosen to die as a tribute to their emperor, in the tradition of the Bushido Code. Enemy resistance on Saipan had been almost completely eliminated. Most of the 30,000 enemy troops had been killed or captured. Virtually all of Saipan, almost to the northern tip at Marpy Point, was now in U.S. possession. Before starting to clean out the remaining area, American forces waited while one last appeal was made to the enemy troops to surrender. Any natives holed up in the area were advised to come into the American lines immediately. Several dozen Chamorros were convinced that they would not be tortured and killed as the enemy had told them, and took advantage of the last opportunity to move into the U.S.-held territory. Finally, the attack was launched against the last piece of enemy-held ground on Saipan. A few more enemy soldiers joined their ancestors. In the closing days of the battle, the number of enemy prisoners was swelled to more than 1,000. But for every Japanese soldier who surrendered, there were many more who refused to give up. Some of the natives chose suicide. On July 9th, the U.S. controlled all of Saipan. On the southern tip of the island, U.S. artillery pounded Tinian, 3 miles distant. After 2 weeks' breather, the 2 Marine divisions assaulted Tinian. The 2nd Marine Division, in an effective feint, drew the enemy's attention to the southern beaches, while 4th Division Marines went ashore to the north and drove down the island against scattered resistance. Back from their fake landing, 2nd Division Marines followed the 4th Division Marines ashore on the northwest coast. The carefully executed diversionary movement had succeeded in fooling the enemy and throwing his defensive forces off balance. The 2nd Division Marines also landed against little or no opposition. Tinian has been termed by some military historians the perfect operation. The drive south by the 2 Marine divisions was as well coordinated as the invasion maneuver. The enemy's defense of Tinian lasted for only 9 days. Aware that their elite army units on Saipan had been wiped out, the Japanese forces on Tinian almost seemed reconciled to their eventual defeat. To the south of Saipan and Tinian, another U.S. amphibious force had moved into position for the assault on Guam on July 21st. Navy warships provided the customary overture to the invasion. Guam was one of the first areas seized by the enemy in December 1941. Marines of the 3rd Division and the 1st Provisional Brigade made the assault on the island. Opposition to the landing was moderate to heavy. The fight to regain Guam looked as though it would be a bloody one. After 2.5 dark years, the long-awaited liberation of America's island outpost was finally at hand. As the campaign continued, the assault Marines were reinforced by the Army's 77th Division. On Guam, the Marines and soldiers worked together well in a closely knit operation. The battle against the stubborn enemy on Guam lasted for 21 days. The 3 major islands in the Marianas had been successfully seized. The Marines were especially gratified at retaking the old Marine Corps base on the island. The natives, Chamorros, who had grown up under American rule until 1941, were again safely in U.S. hands. By late September, Guam had been pretty thoroughly cleaned out. The capital city, Agana, had been hit hard during the bitter struggle for the island. Guam's recent history had been superimposed on the evidences of its Spanish heritage. On Guam, as at Saipan and Tinian, The battle for the island was concluded with a familiar ceremony. On all 3 islands in the Marianas, some 5,000 Marines and soldiers lost their lives in the campaign designed to hasten materially the end of the war with Japan. But for these thousands, the war was already at an end. With the major islands in the strategically important Marianas in U.S. possession, the high brass charged with directing the conduct of the Pacific War moved into the area to prepare for the knockout blows against Japan itself. And the most important items in the planning for the delivery of those knockout blows were the Marianas airstrips. On every newly won island in the Pacific, readying the airstrip was always a top priority assignment. But in the Marianas, that job had a special urgency. For from the improved airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, America's new superfortresses, the powerful B-29s, would soon take off on missions against the enemy's home islands. On the Asiatic mainland, the conduct of the war against Japan was complicated by quite different problems. China, Burma, and India comprised one of the forgotten areas.
Now he's on a battleship in his sailor suit, just a great big sailor man, but he's just...
In the late 1930s, Japan extended its area of control on the Asian continent. To the south, the Emperor's troops concentrated their attacks on China's coastal cities. With the area bordering the sea conquered, Japanese troops sealed off China's armies in the interior most effectively. But Japan was well aware that China was not thoroughly blockaded as long as supplies from the outside world could be brought into Rangoon, thence transported by rail to northern Burma, finally across the mountains to China via the Burma Road. In July 1940, that supply line, too, was sealed off. In Tokyo, the British ambassador, Sir Robert Craigie, advised Japanese Foreign Minister Arita that Great Britain was closing the Burma Road, a move intended to appease Japan, while Britain was engaged in a life-or-death struggle in Europe and Africa. The vital lifeline to China was cut for 3 months. In October, the road was reopened by the British, whose policy in Asia was stiffening, and supplies were again unloaded in Burma for the long overland journey to central China. On that tortuous route depended China's hope for survival in the desperate struggle against the aggressors. By December 7th, 1941, the Japanese had succeeded in winning control of great areas of the Asian continent. On December 8th, Japanese troops in Asia went to work in earnest. One of their main objectives was Burma. Japanese troops quickly took possession of Lower Burma, where the British oil wells were located. Before pulling out, British forces had set fire to the oil fields, which fell into Japanese hands in mid-April 1942. The conquerors embarked at once on a program of winning over the Burmese to their own point of view. Speaking in Burmese, Japanese officers expounded the doctrine of Asia for the Asiatics. The natives in the areas already controlled by the Japanese were skeptical but curious. In the hills where Britain's Indian troops were in hiding, the Japanese were forced to go to a little more trouble to get their message across. Their propaganda was artfully introduced by authentic Indian music. But the invaders weren't relying wholly on propaganda to achieve their objectives. The Burma Road was one of their most important targets in those early months of 1942. On the ground, the Japanese were intent on driving north from their newly conquered territory to cut the Burma Road and completely isolate China. That ambitious plan called for Japanese troops to advance more than 500 miles over difficult terrain against an Allied delaying action. The Emperor's troops attacked with great determination. In late March, the invaders had seized Tunggu, routing Chinese forces commanded by U.S. General Vinegar Joe Stilwell. Thoroughly overpowered, the Allied forces retreated, followed closely by the Japanese, and finally reached Imphal in India just as the monsoon season began. Thus ended one of the most remarkable retreats in military history. Quantities of American munitions and equipment were seized by the enemy during the chase. In their conquest of Burma, the Japanese took a considerable number of British prisoners of war. British resistance in all of Southeast Asia was ended by May 1942. Throughout Asia, British prestige had dropped to a new low. With the Burma lifeline cut, a new route to China was devised, by way of India, thence by air across the towering Himalayas to beleaguered central China. Into Calcutta harbor came thousands of tons of supplies for China's troops, who were still grimly battling the enemy in the interminable struggle. Plus the invaluable vehicles so necessary in mobile 20th century warfare. At airfields in India's province of Assam, great quantities of American material were loaded aboard transport planes for the most difficult leg of the trip. The flight across the Himalayas came to be known in the CBI as flying the hump. Crossing the top of the world was a stirring experience for the airmen assigned to the run. The trip never became routine. The hump had to be cleared at more than 18,000 feet, and there were no possible spots for emergency landings below. Across the formidable mountains lay the plains of China. The airfield at Kunming was the eastern terminus of the hump run. The Chinese gratefully welcomed the weapons and supplies which would enable them to continue the long, desperate struggle against the invaders. But getting that equipment to the Chinese troops was far from an easy job. Transportation in the interior of China was still a primitive operation. The last leg of the trip was achieved by the most ancient methods, at a painfully slow rate of progress. Chiang's forces continued to fall back under the weight of fresh enemy attacks. The Chinese situation from a military standpoint was growing steadily worse. And with every Chinese defeat, thousands of civilian Chinese straggled back from the area seized by the enemy. Headquarters of the Chinese government had been moved to Chongqing as long ago as November 1937. Here, more than 1,000 miles inland, Free China dug in, determined to fight the enemy to the last. Air raid shelters were built out of the solid rock. The inhabitants of Chongqing grew accustomed to sudden raids by enemy planes. China's new capital was a high-priority target for Japanese bombers. As soon as the enemy planes were spotted far out of town, the alarm would be turned in without a moment's delay. Chongqing was bombed with increasing frequency as the enemy gained ground in China. For the Chinese, 1943 was a most critical year in the long war against the Nipponese invaders. Chongqing was also a nerve center for the Chinese communists, who early in the war had agreed to cooperate with the nationalists in the fight against the common enemy. But in practice, the communists rarely cooperated with the Chinese nationalists. Throughout World War II, the nationalists were forced to cope with two enemies. The plight of the Chinese nationalist forces and the Chinese government grew more desperate. Politically as well as militarily, Free China was being backed into a corner. At the Quadrant Conference of Allied Powers in Quebec, the critical problems of Eastern and Southeastern Asia were explored in some detail. It was felt that the confusion of Allied commands in that theater was contributing to the enemy's successes. To help simplify the tangled situation, the Southeast Asia Command was created, to be headed by Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. The new commander took over his post with a great feeling of optimism.
I feel very honored to have been appointed to the Southeast Asia Command. As you know, it is an Allied command, and I am particularly proud to think that there will be United States forces and British forces fighting side by side in the Southeast Asia Command with our Chinese allies until we've finally thrown the Japs out and final victory is won.
China's Generalissimo, unfortunately, did not agree on the conduct of the war with Lord Mountbatten, nor with his deputy, U.S. General Joe Stilwell. But on lower levels, the mixture of Allied forces worked more smoothly. Chinese troops were instructed in the techniques of modern warfare by American soldiers. The Chinese were quick to respond to the American training. From airfields in Chinese territory, U.S. planes of the 14th Air Force flew countless missions against the enemy, which was pressing the attack against the Chinese. The steady, day-by-day operations of the 14th Air Force against the enemy in China helped materially to keep free China in the battle during those dark years. In Burma in late 1943, Allied troops were set to embark on the road back to eventual final victory. In late December, at a small clearing in northern Burma, General Vinegar Joe Stilwell returned to lead the forces back to the territory from which he had retreated a year and a half earlier. In this drive, Stilwell had under his command 2 American-trained Chinese divisions, the 22nd and the 38th. The campaign to take Myitkyina was waged by a force of men fighting against overpowering odds. The Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army at the time, General George Marshall, summed it up in his war reports.
The mission that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had given General Stilwell in Asia was one of the most difficult of the war. He was out at the end of the thinnest supply line of all. He could have only what was left. He had a most difficult physical problem of great distances, almost impassable terrain, widespread disease, and unfavorable climate. He faced an extremely difficult political problem, and his purely military problem of opposing large numbers of enemy with few resources was unmatched in any theater.
In his drive back, General Stilwell was accompanied by another celebrated figure, one of the small force of men who had made the memorable retreat, Dr. Gordon Seagrave, the famed Burma surgeon. During 1943, work was rushed on an overland route from India to a junction with the Burma Road. This ambitious construction project was a corollary of Stilwell's Burma campaign. When completed, the Lido Road would give the Allies a valuable supply artery between India and Burma. The road builders followed closely behind the fighting men. In the construction of the road, American ingenuity was supplemented by time-tested Asian methods. The results were gratifying to everyone connected with the project. But all this effort on the part of more than 20,000 engineers and laborers was to prove eminently worthwhile, for the flow of desperately needed supplies for the Chinese troops could be increased. The enemy still held much of the area through which the road would pass. From Lido in India, the route would wind across the rugged terrain to Myitkyina in northern Burma, and then to a junction with the Burma Road, thus effecting a continuous highway from India to China. Behind the enemy's lines, U.S. General Frank Merrill and a band of 3,000 officers and men who called themselves Merrill's Marauders played a leading role in the fight to gain control of Myitkyina Airfield. Since the Marauders were usually isolated, they were supplied by airdrops of food and munitions. This system of supply on which the success of the Marauders depended demanded a close liaison between air crews and the raiders. In their perilous operations, Merrill's men suffered heavy casualties. Using the same tactics employed to good advantage in Burma a year earlier by Wingate's raiders, the Marauders fought 5 major and 30 minor engagements against a stronger enemy force and achieved their objective. Gliders were employed to ferry some of the fighting engineers to Myitkyina Airfield. To many veterans of the theater, the struggle for Myitkyina Airfield signified the turning of the tide in Burma. The engineers arrived at Myitkyina Airfield soon after it passed into Allied hands in mid-May 1944. In fact, the airfield had just been seized from the enemy when work was begun on repairing the strip. The only all-weather strip in northern Burma, Myitkyina Airfield was vital to the success of the Allied campaign in that country. On the day after the strip was captured, General Stilwell arrived to pay his respects to General Merrill, whose Marauders had succeeded in their difficult assignment. From Myitkyina Airfield, bombing runs could be undertaken against enemy forces in the fight for the territory surrounding the town of Myitkyina. On the ground, forward observers called for more air support. Just as important as the pressing military needs in the CBI were the diplomatic considerations. In an effort to keep peace among the Allied forces in the Orient, the U.S. sent several emissaries to Chungking, among them Vice President Henry Wallace. Mr. Wallace recommended to Washington that China be separated from the command of Zhang's bitter opponent, U.S. General Stilwell, a proposal seconded by the Generalissimo. But U.S. policy in China in 1944 was as variable as the spring breezes which played among the reeds. China's Generalissimo was often toasted one day and scorned the next. In the late summer and early fall of that year, the Chinese were forced to fall back again. Guilin and other cities in southeastern China were abandoned to the enemy. The hapless Chinese were the victims of a determined enemy offensive. Only in China was the Allied position so weak that the enemy could still seize territory in considerable quantity. At Guilin and at Liuzhou, the U.S. 14th Air Force bases were in danger of being overrun and had to be abandoned. Before the American airmen pulled out, they took great pains to be certain that the enemy would not get much use out of the installations in the field. Bombs were set at strategic points on the airstrips. The major air bases at Guilin and Liuzhou were evacuated in the autumn of 1944. The enemy gained possession of an area which included a total of 8 forward U.S. air bases, but not in very usable condition. All over the world, the Allies were driving the enemy back. But in China, the Allied position was steadily deteriorating. In Chongqing, U.S. General Albert Wedemeyer replaced recently recalled General Stilwell as Zhang's chief of staff. In late 1944, the Allied military picture grew somewhat brighter. In China and India, the finishing touches were added to air bases which accommodated America's newest and largest bombers. From these bases, it was confidently felt, the enemy's offensives could be effectively dispersed by America's newest air weapon. The new B-29s, operating in the CBI as the 20th Air Force, were capable of covering a range of targets which stretched from Rangoon to Japan itself. In the reconquest of Burma, the superfortresses were used in softening up the enemy's hold on the country's capital and chief port, Rangoon. In one raid on Rangoon, 56 B-29s participated. To the north, Mandalay was under attack by Allied planes and British ground forces for more than 2 months. The Southeast Asia commander, Lord Mountbatten, inspected Mandalay soon after its capture by British forces. Meanwhile, in lower Burma, between Mandalay and Rangoon, American bombers attacked enemy military targets for the first time with Azon bombs, directed to their pinpointed objectives by radio control. The results were most successful. The capture of Rangoon was speeded up by an invasion from the air. A force of Gurkha paratroopers jumped in an assault on a strong point which dominated the approach to Rangoon. The operation went off smoothly, but it developed that the air invasion had not been necessary after all. British ground forces entering Rangoon via landings along the coast found that the enemy had abandoned the city. 38 months after Rangoon had been forfeited to the aggressors, Burma's capital was once again in British hands. The reconquest of Burma had required the services of more than 1 million men. But final victory always made the long, bitter campaign seem worthwhile. In the retaking of Burma, a considerable number of British prisoners were liberated. Some had been taken captive by the enemy 3 years before, but throughout their long internment, they never gave up hope. In early 1945, the first truck convoy left from Lido, India, bound for China via the Lido and Burma roads, now linked. This invaluable artery across the rugged mountains helped materially to speed up the flow of supplies to China. But even in full operation, the overland route, christened the Stilwell Road, accounted for only 1/3 as much tonnage as was flown across the hump in the waning months of the war. To facilitate the flow of fuel from India to northern Burma and China, several pipelines were constructed. From India, the fuel was pumped via pipe as far as Kunming, more than 900 miles away. Thus, one more lifeline was established with beleaguered China. In early 1945, the Chinese mounted an offensive and succeeded in forcing the enemy back somewhat in certain areas. But though the Chinese scored limited gains, the Japanese were by no means in retreat throughout China. By the closing months of World War II, the Chinese gained some ground, but also lost much valuable territory. Zhang's forces continued to attack, but even the most optimistic of his allies never felt that the Chinese could win back China. In other parts of the Pacific theater, the Allied situation was brighter. In September 1944, a group of islands in the Carolines was vital to U.S. success in the Western Pacific. From Palau, U.S. planes could launch attacks against the Philippines, preparatory to an invasion.
Bell-bottom trousers, coat of navy blue. She loves a sailor and he loves her too.
In the late summer of 1944, the Allied advance in the Western Pacific pointed to a quickening schedule of invasions. Morotai and the Halmahera group was an obvious target on the drive from New Guinea. On the right flank of that route lay Palau. The necessity for the invasion of the Palau Islands was discussed by the top Army and Navy commanders in the Pacific at great length. General MacArthur, intent on retaking the Philippines, felt that Palau must be seized to secure his right flank, and also to provide a base from which air cover could be furnished for the Philippine operation. Admiral Nimitz agreed. Admiral Halsey, on the other hand, felt that the Palau campaign was not really necessary. During September, Halsey's Third Fleet was on the prowl in the waters off the southern Philippines and launched its planes in attacks against enemy airfields on those islands. The carrier planes' attacks were highly successful. Because of the light opposition to these carrier raids on the Philippines, Halsey recommended that Palau be bypassed, a recommendation which was not followed by his superiors. At home in the late summer of 1944, America was demonstrating that she was fully capable of waging warfare successfully against the enemies in Europe and in Asia. Less than 3 years after Pearl Harbor, U.S. industry was achieving miracles in producing the machines and weapons of war in unbelievable quantities. America was geared completely to the demands of the two-ocean war. Supplying the troops on both sides of the world was the nation's #1 business. By the late summer of '44, America's millions had adjusted with good grace to the inconveniences and shortages of wartime living. America was solidly behind the two wars being fought on far-flung battlefields. On Main Street and on Broadway, U.S. citizens were investing in that war. To shorten the time needed to win that war, the people, young and old, directed all their energies toward one goal: the backing up of American fighting men. Of course, everybody had to relax once in a while, especially the servicemen just back from the fronts. And there was a good deal to be happy about. Paris had been liberated, and Patton was racing across France. Most Americans felt it wouldn't be too long before the Nazis were knocked out of the war. Then the U.S. could really go to work on Japan. Mounting confidence was evident all over the United States. But there were constant reminders, too, that the war wasn't quite won, that there were still costly battles to be fought. In the Western Pacific in early September 1944, the war was being carried forward toward eventual final victory by the powerful amphibious forces which were driving deeper into the enemy's zone of defense. The immediate objective was the group of islands called Palau. To seize the most strategically important islands in that chain, a force of sizable proportions was dispatched, assigned to bombard and invade the designated target islands in mid-September. The decision on which islands of the group to invade was a difficult one. The largest number of Japanese troops was concentrated on Babeltuap, the largest island. Less than half as many enemy troops garrisoned Peleliu, which also had an airstrip. A relatively small force defended Angaur, which was in a commanding position at the base of the Palau chain. The amphibious force which moved northwestward through the far Pacific was to strike at the last two of those islands, Peleliu and Angaur. The naval and troop commanders checked over the planned invasions for the last time. On September 15th, 1944, the assault was begun on Peleliu Island by the men of the 1st Marine Division. The last pre-invasion airstrikes were made, concluding 3 days of softening up enemy strong points by strafing and bombing. Peleliu was to be invaded and captured so that U.S. forces would gain possession of the vitally important airfield on the island, a key to the control of the Western Pacific area. Before the assault troops stormed ashore on Peleliu, the approaches to the beach were prepared for the first waves of boats. This delicate and hazardous job fell to the underwater demolition teams, composed of selected Navy and Marine volunteers, popularly known as frogmen. The underwater demolition men had to be able to swim long distances underwater and to work well completely on their own. The frogmen had to work quickly, first in locating the obstacle to be removed, natural or artificial, and then to set the high explosive charge correctly under the most difficult conditions. Then the trick was to get back to the pickup boat without being spotted by the enemy. Once safely out of the immediate area, the job was completed. During the latter years of World War II, the frogmen enabled many invasions to go off smoothly. Early on D-Day morning, the Navy's warships sought to soften up the beaches by the final pre-invasion bombardment. Though the battle on shore was expected to be another Tarawa, the Navy complained that they had run out of targets. But there were many installations which the Navy's guns did not even touch. As each hour neared, the Combat Information Center aboard ship became the nerve center of the operation. At 6:30 on D-Day morning, the amphibian tractors carrying their complement of assault troops started for the line of departure, the area from which the final dash to the beach would be begun. The landing craft, each one a part of a designated wave, rendezvoused before making the coordinated move toward the beaches. In the Peleliu invasion, each step of the operation by each unit was reported to the top commanders on the command ship. They were thus able to gain an overall picture of the situation.
Wave 1 crossed final line of departure at 0825.
On deck, the troop commanders watched anxiously as the landing craft moved toward the beaches. The assault troops were preceded by a rocket barrage, directed against the area behind the landing beaches. Resistance on Peleliu was expected to be heavy. As the armored amphibians moved toward shore, they drew heavy fire from the enemy, a good indication of what was in store on the beaches. As the landing craft neared the shore, the atmosphere aboard the command ship became charged with tension. Each message received from the assault units helped fill in a vital part of the broad mosaic of the battle for the beachhead. This was the first amphibious assault made by the 1st Marine Division to be opposed by the enemy. The landings at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, New Britain, had been nothing like this. In the Marine Corps, the 1st Division had earned the reputation of drawing operations which entailed easy landings. But at Peleliu, this tradition of good luck was dissipated. The first waves hit the beach to the accompaniment of intense enemy mortar and artillery fire. The prediction that it would be rough turned out to be an understatement. Casualties on the beaches were heavy. The 1st Marine Division was paying dearly for the small strip of coral and sand along Peleliu's western shore. To hold on to the slim foothold, the Marines had to drive quickly inland to deepen their beachhead. In the face of withering enemy fire, they pushed ahead. On the left flank, the battle was particularly tough. The 3rd Battalion of the 1st Marine Regiment ran into very heavy opposition. A brutal fight developed. On D-Day on Peleliu, the situation reports on the fierce and confused fighting were relayed regularly to the top command. The line against the enemy was broken by 2 major gaps, so serious that the position of the entire U.S. force on the island was endangered.
Spitfire 1, we are under heavy enfilade fire.
The critical situation was followed with careful attention to every minute detail by the commanders of the operation on the command ship offshore. On the afternoon of D-Day on Peleliu, the Marines found themselves faced with the necessity of stopping a strong enemy counterattack. The men of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment braced themselves for the attack. At 4:50 o'clock, the Marines opened up with everything they had. In the savage battle, American tanks once again took the measure of the obsolete Japanese models. The enemy counterattack failed completely and ended in a familiar way. The first objective for which the Marines were fighting so bitterly was the airfield on Peleliu. To seize that airstrip, the exhausted Marines pushed on in a determined effort to gain that prize before nightfall. By the late afternoon, the Marines had possession of part of that objective. But the conquest of Peleliu wasn't to be as brief as originally planned. The biggest obstacle to the Marines' progress was Bloody Nose Ridge. Holed up inside many of the peaks in that ridge, the Japanese troops could exist for a long period, could enter and leave by any one of a number of passages. It was up to the Marines to clean the enemy out of every cave entrance, and they attacked the job with great determination. To take Bloody Nose Ridge on Peleliu was one of the toughest spot actions of the entire Pacific War. Casualties in the lines were taken back to a more protected area, but sometimes that job was almost impossible. Many of the casualties were taken to a safer position behind the front, right under the sights of the enemy's guns. During the first 2 days, one company alone suffered 67% casualties. It became apparent that this was to be no quick operation. As often as possible, badly wounded Marines were taken off the island entirely, out of range of the enemy's fire. During many of the Pacific campaigns, the wounded American serviceman was transferred quickly to a waiting hospital ship standing by offshore. Often, the entire trip from the front lines to the sanctuary of the ship's hospital took less than an hour. Many of the difficult surgical cases would not have been saved in former wars. Indeed, the advances made in medical science during World War II helped keep U.S. casualties at a minimum. Thanks directly to the efficient work of the Army and Navy doctors and the Nurse Corps, the lives of thousands of American fighting men were saved. The invasion of Angkor was made by the Army's 81st Division on September 17th, 2 days after the assault on Peleliu. The 81st, nicknamed the Wildcat Division, was commanded by General Paul Mueller, who led his troops into combat for the first time on Angkor. After the customary softening up of the beaches, the men of the 81st landed against light resistance and went about the job of seizing the island from the enemy garrison force. Angauer was not heavily defended, but the enemy had to be wiped out yard by yard. The GIs on Angauer suffered some casualties too, but fortunately not a high percentage of the troops committed. The frontline work of the Army medics under fire was notable. For 4 days, the GIs pressed the attack on Angauer. On September 20th, all organized resistance ceased. The enemy's defense of Angauer had crumbled. The island was declared officially secure on that 4th day. Without any loss of time, Army engineers went to work on the construction of an airstrip on the island. The work of clearing the area was carried forward under enemy sniper fire. The field on Angauer would provide a second bomber strip in the Palaus and would lessen the amount of traffic on the Palaleu strip. Construction was continued even after dark. The GI in charge of the lights which flooded the area was ready to pull the switch in a second if an alert was sounded. On Palaleu, the Marines were having a tougher time dealing with the enemy in the caves of Bloody Nose Ridge, a fortress which was proving virtually impregnable to the Marines' continuing attacks. Progress was slow. The Marines advanced slightly, only to be stopped after each small gain. Sometimes the Marines would be thrown back from their newly won positions. The call for air support was quickly answered. The men on the ground took a short breather while Marine pilots went to work on the enemy. The crescendo of the howitzers prefaced each new attack. Some areas of Bloody Nose Ridge were fought for several times. On Palaleu, advances were often measured in terms of a few yards. Once in a great while, the Marines gave their weapons a short rest. The Navy hospital corpsmen had plenty to do. Casualties were mounting at an alarming rate. General William Rupertus felt that his 1st Marine Division could carry on without help. But his superior, 3rd Amphibious Corps Commander Marine General Roy Geiger, felt that it would be wise to bring in, as reinforcement, a regimental combat team from the Army's 81st Division, relatively fresh after the short struggle on Angauer. The GIs of the 321st Infantry Regiment were to relieve a badly chewed-up Marine regiment, the 1st, which had been clawing at the enemy at Bloody Nose Ridge for 8 straight days. The soldiers were to work with elements of the 7th Marine Regiment in the drive north to secure the northern section of Palaleu. The Army troops edged around the ridge and approached it from the north, in a move coordinated with Marine attacks from the sides of the ridge. Some of the Marines were assisted by war dogs, who were trained to detect the enemy's presence. The fight for Bloody Nose raged on. From the airfield on Palaleu, Marine pilots took off on the shortest bomb run in World War II in the Pacific, 1,000 yards to the target, Bloody Nose Ridge, more formally called Umabrokel Mountain. Sometimes the planes dropped napalm-filled belly tanks with instantaneous fuse mechanisms. The results were most effective. Napalm, which had first been used against the enemy on Tinian, often proved more devastating than regular bombs, particularly on jagged terrain. Week after week, U.S. troops assaulted Bloody Nose Ridge with every weapon available. A favorite weapon of Japanese soldiers on suicide missions was the Bangalore torpedo. While the campaign on Peleliu was continuing, it became apparent that a supplementary operation would have to be conducted against an adjoining island, Ngaysobus, which was given a once-over by the Marine pilots. On September 28th, Marines of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, conducted a well-executed shore-to-shore operation from Peleliu to Ngaysobus. This small-scale invasion was necessary to deny the enemy the use of a base for his artillery, which was being directed against U.S. troops on Peleliu. Ngaysobus was seized without too much difficulty by the 1,000th Marines. The island was taken quickly, and U.S. losses were light. On Peleliu, the fight for Bloody Nose continued without let-up. By the end of September, the enemy was losing control of the island. A number of Japanese soldiers surrendered, but they represented only a part of the force still alive on Peleliu. For every enemy soldier who gave himself up, there were many more still holed up in the caves of Bloody Nose Ridge. On Peleliu, a handful of Japanese troops were taken alive before the island was termed secure. As for the rest, the U.S. forces spent another 8 weeks sealing up cave entrances in the last pocket of enemy resistance, an area about 900 yards long and 400 yards wide. By late November, the enemy was all finished on Peleliu. In taking 2 key islands in the Palaus, U.S. fighting men had seized a valuable area in the far reaches of the western Pacific. The Stars and Stripes flew over the most westerly of the Caroline Islands after a campaign which ranked with the most bitterly fought of the war in the Pacific. From that territory, won at a cost of more than 1,600 American lives, U.S. forces were in position for their next move. In October, a sizable airstrip capable of accommodating heavy bombers was in operation on Angkor. From that field, U.S. bomber pilots made periodic runs over some of the islands in the Palau group which had not been invaded by American amphibious forces. The pilots concentrated on enemy positions on Babaltuap and Koror. Occasionally, these routine missions proved fatal. But gradually, the air over the western Pacific came under U.S. control. With Morotai and the Moluccas functioning as one air base and the Palaus as another, U.S. planes could easily cover the forthcoming invasion of the Philippines. Starting in October, U.S. bombers operating from Palau attacked Japanese fields and installations in the Philippines. And just 1 month after D-Day at Peleliu, U.S. invasion forces were en route to the long-awaited invasion of the Philippine Islands.